thanks for joining us
Sure.
and taking the trip out to Colorado Springs. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
Yeah, your first book, God's Law and Order, has been a incredibly important book in the contemporary history of evangelicalism, and in a growing movement of people considering what it means to think about mass incarceration politics from a consensus model of history. And I think the book offers what you call a religious history of mass incarceration, which centers the role in particular that evangelicals have played in shaping the public consensus around tough on crime politics. You write that, for instance, quote, post-war evangelicals helped make crime something to fear, even as fear of crime helped make post-war evangelicalism, unquote. Why was the evangelical focus on law and order so central in the post-war era? And how do you see that focus as having shaped evangelicalism's cultural influence at that time?
Yeah, that's a great question. And thanks again for having me here. Uh, I think in the post-war era, evangelicals are, they're trying to do a couple of things, but one thing that they're concerned about, and this is what some scholars will call the neo-evangelical movement. New evangelicals are trying to come to terms with their place in American culture and society as people who have fairly traditional religious commitments and beliefs, but who want to be culturally, socially, politically engaged, and to do it in a winsome, thoughtful, influential manner. So a lot of what I saw in my research was in the early post-war era, a lot of evangelicals are talking about crime in pretty straightforward conversionist terms. So people like Billy Graham or the Assemblies of God minister David Wilkerson are talking about crime and delinquency as these issues that can be solved by just converting people who are criminals, converting people that are sinners, and if they come to Jesus, then crime will decrease. But for many neo-evangelicals over the course of the 50s and 60s, that answer, that conversionist response is not sufficient. And what is needed is a way to reckon politically with this problem of crime. And so I try to show in the book this transition from that more conversionist, maybe classically missionary kind of response to one where evangelicals are like, hold on, we can have a theory of the state. We can have a theory, a political theology. We can think constructively about what it means to be in government, to be on the police force, to be in law enforcement. And this is why evangelicals start doing things like reaching out to FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, who is not himself an evangelical exactly, but is interested in writing articles for evangelical magazines. So becoming influential, becoming politically savvy, I think is part of it. If you care about crime, if you care about disorder, there's different responses, but politics is going to be one of those responses. Criminal justice will be one. The other part of it, and this is where in my research, I initially started here, but in some ways the research for the book made me realize that I maybe wanted to actually end here. But evangelicals care about places where they see the gospel needing to be brought. And for them, that's prison. Prisons are places that evangelicals see as needing the message of Jesus, needing Christian presence. And so in the 70s, especially 60s, late 60s and 1970s, evangelicals see prisons as this prime place for a new missionary kind of movement, a domestic mission crusade, where they can go and they have what they unironically would call a captive audience, and they can bring these people to Christ, and in doing so, accomplish some of those earlier goals that they set out to achieve in reducing crime. Yeah, so that's where I think evangelicals are in that immediate post-war moment, and they're triangulating this sort of interest in becoming politically, culturally relevant while still keeping in touch with that conversionist impulse.
Yeah, and you note how they are very successful at allying with various political causes and figures over the years. And I think that's a really critical part of how you're contributing to this growing consensus model around mass incarceration. That scholarly push to understand mass incarceration as a growing consensus is opposed to how earlier historians have emphasized how conservatives and liberals viewed crime and punishment differently.
Yeah.
And the consensus model, by contrast, emphasizes how people of all political stripes, even as they loudly disagreed about how to deal with crime's particulars, broadly agreed that crime was a key social issue and required more government action. So, how does focusing on evangelicalism's articulation of law and order politics help us better understand that post war American consensus around the policies that shaped mass incarceration?
Yeah, that's a great question. For me, I started to figure this out through the work of a couple of different people. The first was scholars like Elizabeth Hinton, Naomi Murakawa, people who were doing carceral studies or the history of mass incarceration, but were trying to move away from, as you mentioned, this maybe earlier generation of locating mass incarceration or tough on crime politics as simply a conservative backlash. So Naomi Murakawa's book was very important for me, and her book is about like how liberals basically helped build the carceral state on liberal terms. Elizabeth Hinton's work, looking at the way that the Lyndon Johnson years were crucial for sort of setting the terms for law and order politics, arguably just as much as the Nixon years or the Reagan years. So that body of research was so important for me for sort of being an interpretive shift. At the same time, I was reading the work of scholars like Axel Schaefer, who are writing about evangelicals in a way that I think is different than how they've been narrated in the past, and maybe even how they're narrated now. Schaefer and others were trying to pay attention to the ways that evangelicals were often politically conservative, but that didn't necessarily mean that they were anti-state. Schaefer says in one of his works that they were anti-statist statists. And I was noticing how there was this interesting interplay between evangelicals occupying perhaps this more statist position than they were often given credit for, and at the same time narrating mass incarceration with reference to this liberal consensus. And I thought, what if we actually paid attention to the ways evangelicals are, yes, punitive, yes, law and order politics down the line, but they're actually doing that in a way that isn't out of step with liberal consensus concerns, political culture. They're actually doing it in a way that endears them to that same kind of culture and gives them a place in American society where they have some sort of authority.
Yeah. Yeah, and you even start much farther back. In your first chapter, for instance, you highlight how evangelical concern for a law and order politics is really crystallizing in the post-Reconstruction era, and particularly with religious outrage towards the lynching of African Americans. These arguments that evangelicals were forming in that era often portrayed the widespread existence of extrajudicial violence through lynchings as a threat to the state itself. Yes. Even as they reproduced racist ideas about inherent black criminality. Scholars have articulated a very wide range of perspectives on how Reconstruction reoriented American racial politics, but how do you situate the role of evangelical Christianity within this era and differentiate your understanding from other scholars of that same period?
Yeah, I realize here, and I struggle with this in the book a little bit, but using even the term evangelical in that moment is tricky because American Protestants are there's a wide variety of them, and they're doing a lot of different things. But what I wanted to show in the late 19th and early 20th centuries in this moment, like with regards to lynching, is that there were undoubtedly American Protestants, many who we would call evangelicals, who were caught up in sort of this lynching fervor, this like white supremacist violence as a way to redeem the South or something. But there were also a lot of American Protestants, perhaps the majority, that didn't like lynching, but they didn't frame their critiques of it in the same way that African Americans often did, as an inherent white supremacist act of violence that's a threat to black people. They were much more concerned with its threat to law, its threat to the proper operation of the criminal justice system. So there's a line in the book from one leader that I discussed where he says something like, the real victim of lynch law is the government. And I thought that was so interesting to watch American Protestants, many of whom were quite theologically conservative, make that argument, not as a way to, they were frustrated about lynching, but they were not so much in solidarity with African Americans, African American Christians, as they were wanting to be in solidarity with the state, the proper functioning of the government. So yeah, and what I wanted to trace was how that kind of idea that the state offers not only security, but that it can be viewed as kind of this assurance of the rule of law has theological weight to it, how that gets built upon throughout then the early 20th, mid 20th century as evangelicals are trying to increasingly be influential in American life.
Yeah, I really think that understanding law and order politics through this religious lens offers an important way to understand how the conservative response to contemporary policing and prison reform movements really works, as you're emphasizing the way that this political theology is shaping an understanding of the state and its proper role. Because if law and order is understood as a religious mandate, then civil disobedience and protest is not only socially disruptive, it is ungodly and unchristian. So how protesters are framed becomes to be as violating a biblical command for reverence to the law. What other perspectives do you hope people gain by thinking about law and order politics through a religious framework?
I mean, something that this may sound more like something that a theologian or a biblical scholar would say than a historian of modern American Christianity. But I'm so struck by how there is so much within the Christian faith, both its sacred texts, its theology, it's the history of Christianity itself, where Christians are wrestling with what does it mean to not only be citizens of this world, even as they're also citizens of heaven, but they're wrestling with the fact that their Savior was crucified on an instrument of state violence, of criminal justice. And I think that this is something that is at the heart of even more contemporary American Christian grapplings with law and order politics, police brutality, is looking for where the crosses are today, I guess you could say, and coming to terms with the fact that people like the Apostle Paul, writers of the New Testament, often they are writing from prison themselves. They are speaking about not political theology in the abstract, but an on-the-ground reckoning with a state that is often very hostile to their concerns and their vision of what the Christian community might mean. And so I think that I see so many echoes of this today. In 2020, I feel like I saw as people were debating the protests and debating all these cases of these incidents of police brutality or violence, I saw so many of these resonances of debates throughout Christian history of what is actually the authority of the state? How should Christians understand what Caesar can and can't do? At what point does an unjust law become no law at all? I think this is going to be an ongoing conversation, especially not just with regards to prisons, punishment, policing, but as more and more Christians are arguing with one another about the merits of political authority in the current Trump administration.
Yeah, you suggest, for instance, that the contemporary evangelical alignment with conservative politics broadly, or with an expanding policing and incarceration set of policies was not historically inevitable.
Yeah.
You write, for instance, about the gospel of forgiveness that shaped many early evangelical forays into prison ministry, often with the belief that the goal of punishment should be forgiveness and social repair. What for you is the importance of understanding alternative evangelical visions of crime and punishment, and what lessons might we learn from them?
Yeah, I think something that I have learned a lot from other scholars and activists working in spaces around incarceration, criminal justice, policing, is that it seems like prisons and systems of punishment, policing, the way we do this stuff is timeless. It just seems like these are features of our life that, of course, we do it this way or this is how it's always been. But what I hope, I say this in the conclusion of my book, like I hope attention to contingency can be understood by evangelicals themselves and other American Christians especially as an invitation to imagine like a different world, to think about that we made these things. We human beings build our society, we build these systems, these institutions, and when they are harmful, when they are not creating the kind of life that is good for us, we can change them. Like there are other possibilities out there. It's really hard. It's really hard to break out of those institutional, psychological, even theological frames of mind where we see certain kinds of practices of punishment as the way we do things. But I think attention to contingency just gives us a sense of hope that it doesn't have to be this way. Something that I've wrestled with a lot, and I've wanted. I hope this comes through in the book, is that so much of what evangelicals can do in this moment is actually embrace the best of who I think they are, and while acknowledging failures, acknowledging weaknesses. And part of that means just simply listening to the voices of other evangelicals who are incarcerated, who have been arrested, who have been had their families or their own lives shaped, sometimes in very harmful, tragic ways, by the criminal justice system. To listen to their stories, to hear what life is like on the inside. And for me, that kind of building is of relationships, of ministries, of partnerships, of fellowship together is the future that I personally long for.
Yeah. You begin in your introduction by even writing about your personal connection to this question and how your foray into prison ministry shaped some of the questions that you sought to answer through writing this book. Yeah. Could you talk more about how your personal connection to this topic and this historical project is important to you or shapes your ongoing commitments? Or
yeah. I have been, I think I could say, blessed by being able to be friends and ministry partners and we might say a brother in Christ with folks who are incarcerated and learn from them and learn from other people that do prison ministry. And yeah, that was an important part of my own seminary training. It's something I try to continue doing now, to stay in touch with friends who are incarcerated and connected to them and their concerns. And it's not like a solution to, if only we did more of that, necessarily things would just automatically be transformed. But I think it's actually, for me, it's been an invitation into seeing new spaces, new kinds of relationships and friendships and possibilities. And I've learned so much. The times I've been inside prisons, when I've taught inside a prison, when I've gone inside of prisons with ministries, there are times when I learn a lot. I see, again, personally speaking, I see God at work, and I hear the voices of my brothers and sisters, and they teach me things. And that has been so transformative for me in my own, certainly my own scholarship, but also my own life of faith and my own sense of what it means to do the work that I do as a historian, as a Christian myself. So that's where I would just encourage anyone who's curious at all about this to just go to prisons, go get to know your local courthouse, go to your county jail. And if you'll be surprised, actually, I think, one, you'll come to realize like, oh, this is my tax dollars that are making this stuff possible. But also you'll start to realize like, oh, this is actually a place where maybe I can learn something, where I can start being connected to these communities and these people and advocate for them. That it isn't just it's not simply something over there, but this is actually part of my community as well. That kind of awareness is something I'm still working on, but it's something that's been really transformative for me.
Yeah. As you're sort of concluding this project and moving forward, what are the kinds of questions you're left with that you're working on? What is the sort of direction of the work that you continue to develop?
Yeah. So the project I'm working on right now for my research is I'm looking not at evangelical Christians for a new book project, but looking at how other American religious communities interface with local police departments, especially with police chaplaincy. I've been really interested in the ways that religious identities are formed on the local level. I think so often we talk about politics, even using terms like Christian nationalism, which can be very helpful, but we use that to refer to national political debates, parties, candidates. And I'm very interested in how religious identity is formed within political institutions on a very local level. And I think police departments are a great place to sort of explore that. I'm also interested in this because I think police officers have really difficult jobs, and they themselves face all kinds of stresses and problems that and are put in very sometimes impossible situations based on what we as a society have asked them to do. And I'm interested in how religious traditions and communities, leadership roles have tried to reckon with those stresses and those problems that police officers face. That's the kind of thing I'm interested in now, is maybe sort of the other side of the criminal justice equation. What does it mean to serve God as a part of the state itself in that very local, practical way? What are the problems, the tensions inherent to that? Are those tensions actually resolvable or not? Those are the kinds of things I'm interested in.
Yeah, important work. And thank you very much for taking the time to sit down and talk with us about your work.
Thanks for having me here. It's so good. Thanks.
Appreciate it.